What's up, everybody? This is Dan Korth. Welcome back to the Engineered Impact Podcast. Yesterday we talked about saving. We talked about an article that I saw that was talking about how saving is a threat to the economy, right? And I went off a little bit about that because it bothers me when the media tries to convince us that behaviors that are good and are healthy and are important are actually bad for us, right? So I wanted to explore that idea a little bit more today. One of the biggest problems that is facing America in the future is retirement, right? We all grow up with this idea that we go to school, we get a job, we work for however long, 30, 40, 50 years, whatever it is, and then we retire, right? And retirement is supposed to be the golden years. That's when we get to go travel. It's when we get to go do all the things that we never did because we couldn't afford them. We didn't have the time. We had kids at home, whatever the reason, right? Retirement is when we get to go enjoy the fruits of our labor, right? The problem is for many, many, many people, they're going into retirement or they're in retirement. And one of their biggest concerns is running out of money, right? And so this period of your life that's supposed to be wonderful and joyous and you live out the best years of your life is turning out to be a little bit more of a nightmare for many people. This fear of running out of money is one of the biggest concerns that a lot of people have, both as they're preparing for retirement and in retirement, right? It's one of those questions you got to sit back and look at the abundance that exists in America and wonder what the heck is going on, right? I looked up some statistics because I'm an engineer and I'm a nerd and I like numbers, right? Fidelity did a study at the end of, or somewhere mid-2019, and they broke down average retirement balances, retirement account balances, 401ks that they had control over by age group. And so they go by decades, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way up through 60s, okay? And what they found was very interesting to me. For the group in their 60s, the average retirement account balance was $195,500. Okay. Now that's a lot of money if you're making it in a year, but if you're looking at the prospect of having to live off that for 30 or 40, 50 years, especially as you look at, increased medical costs and things like that, that is not a lot of money, right? But even more concerning, the median account balance for that demographic of folks in their 60s was only $62,000, right? So half of the people with accounts at Fidelity had less than $62,000 to retire on, okay? So I look at that and I go, good grief, how is that possible that after 40 years, that's all someone has, right? That half the people in the country have that little or less, right? And so I wanted to see, if I go back to the 20s, people in their 20s, and I look at the average person, right? What would the average person who's behaving in an average way expect to have when they retire? Okay. So what I did is I went back to Fidelity's data for somebody in their 20s, and they reported that on average, those people were saving about 7%. Okay. So I went through and I figured out the average graduate today, college graduate, is making about $50,000. So I said, all right, if I started out making $50,000 and worked for 40 years and I only got cost of living increases of 3% every single year. So basically my salary just kept pace with inflation, 3% a year every year for 40 years. I save 7% and I get a market return of 8% on my savings, okay? Depending who you want to believe, the stock market on average returns 8 to 12% a year, right? So I said, okay, what's the result of doing that over the course of 40 years, right? So every year I get a 3% raise. My savings goes up a little bit, but I'm saving 7% consistently throughout my career, and I'm getting 8% a year every year, right? You could argue those are pretty conservative results, right? I'm assuming you're never going to get a promotion. You're never going to have a job change where you get a significant raise. You're just kind of plodding along as an average person, right? So at the end of that, at the end of your 40-year career, what I found is that you would have an account balance of about $330,000, $340,000, okay? Not bad, right? Probably still going to worry about it in retirement, but that's a decent chunk of change, right? And when I look at that and I think, okay, so that guy, that's doing just the average, right? Nothing special. Probably wasn't an A player in his career because he never got a big raise. Still ended up with $336,000. I think that was the exact number, right? So when I compare that to the average balance of 195.5, or even worse, the median balance of 62 in your 60s, I have to step back and say, what is really going on here, right? Because clearly this system is not working. Okay. Now, there's a lot of reasons we could talk about this, right? And you could assume, well, the average person's not saving in enough and they're blowing all their money. And, in some cases that's true. But when I look at that, when I see that the average person that's worked for 30 or 40 years doesn't have a prayer of retiring and living for 30 or 40 years on what they've saved, clearly there's something more going on, right? There's a systemic problem. You can't pin that on individuals in every case, right? So to me, that speaks of a systemic problem. And this problem interests me, and this problem is a lot of what got me looking closer at this system way back in 2011. Okay, and if you listen to any of my backstory, you know that I came into my career in 2007, just before the market peaked, right, and the Great Recession started. And so right from the very beginning, I saw this front and center. I saw people that were at the point of retirement within the next few years that all of a sudden couldn't retire, right? Now, these are folks that had done everything right? These were engineers. These were people that were making good salaries. They'd saved, they'd done everything they were supposed to do. And yet when it came time for them to retire and to go off, into the sunset and go play golf and hang out with their grandkids, they couldn't do it, right? And at first, I had the thought, well, gosh, I got to go figure out, how do I not end up like that guy, right? Clearly that person didn't do something right. And so for me, it just started as how do I invest my 401k better so that I don't end up in that same boat, right? Well, what I realized within a matter of months is it really isn't an individual problem. Again, it was a systemic problem. And so as I started to go down the rabbit hole of how does this system work? How is it set up? How does the money flow in and out? What I found is that, again, there are some very fundamental problems with the structure that most of us are using to plan and save for retirement. And the result of those problems is that even if you do everything right, it may work out. You may end up with plenty of money in there, but there's a good chance you won't. And I think the average numbers speak to that. Okay. So I wanted to kind of go through what those problems were that I uncovered. And I'm certainly not the first person to bring these up, but I'd like to just summarize what I learned over the course of several years. Okay. One of the first things I found, well, this was a couple years into my journey as I think about it, but I read the book Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. And this book was first published in 1994. And way back then, he was starting to talk about issues with the retirement systems that Americans were depending on. He was talking about the fact that pensions were going away for more and more people. He was talking about some of the structural problems with qualified retirement plans, like the 401ks that had become popular in the 1980s. As pensions were being phased out and these qualified plans were being phased in, he had started to recognize some problems with these plans. And so Rich Dad Poor Dad was meant to be kind of a wake-up call, I guess, a way to introduce people to some concepts that were not being taught in the mainstream financial media, to help people understand what it was going to take to be successful. Okay. And so one of the concepts that he introduced in there that kind of rocked my world a little bit was the idea that savers are losers. Okay. And it took me a while to accept that, but as I read it, as I understood it, as I looked around and studied other things, I had to admit that he was right. Okay. Now you may be thinking, Dan, wait a minute. Yesterday you were just ranting and raving about how saving is critical and I've got to do it. And if I can't do it, I have no hope of being wealthy, right? That's true. Saving is the fundamental habit of building any kind of wealth. If you want any hope of being financially free, yeah, you got to be a good saver, right? What Robert meant by that is that you cannot save your way to wealth. Okay. So to understand that, let's go back in time a little bit. Okay. So both of my grandpas came home from World War II, got a little bit of education. One of them went and started a business. One of them went and became a banker. Okay. So the grandpa that went and became a banker, he worked for several decades for the same company, never had to worry about, losing his job. He had a pension that lasted him for almost as long as he worked. It was like 30 some years that he was collecting a pension, okay, every month, from that employer. Social Security was solvent, meaning there was more money coming in than into the Social Security system than was being paid out, right? And so they were able to rely on that Social Security system all of their lives. And on top of that, both of them were good savers. And in their times, they were able to put money in even a savings account paid a reasonable rate of return, right? You could invest in government bonds, you could invest in corporate bonds. There were a lot of ways to earn a safe interest rate that would grow your money at a higher rate than inflation. And between those three things, a pension, Social Security, and your savings, you could comfortably retire and live for decades. Okay, and that's exactly what my one grandpa did. The other one started a business. And it was a laundromat. It was a small business, but he did fairly well for himself. And so when he retired, again, he had saved a lot. He had built a business. He'd built up assets that continued to provide income for him. He had Social Security and he had savings. And so he, again, was able to retire on those and live for several decades. Okay. So that was the world that existed when they started working, and that's the world that they lived their careers in, right? Now, fast forward one generation, things started to change, right? Now, some people still had pensions, but layoffs became a thing. Reductions in force, right sizing, whatever you want to call it, whatever euphemism corporate America started to apply to these things, people could no longer count on going to work for one company and being there for 40 years, right? So the pensions went away. Over time, Social Security, for a variety of reasons, became insolvent. Okay. Today, Social Security does not bring in enough money to cover its expenses every year. Okay. And so every year there's money. Not only are they consuming all of the Social Security taxes that they're collecting, but they're burning down the money that used to be going into the trust fund. Okay. So by the time I'm retirement age, I am not planning on there being any Social Security for me. If it's there, great, but I'm not counting on it. Right. On top of that, interest rates have plummeted consistently for the last 30 to 40 years. Okay. And so the point is, the things that retirees used to be able to count on, safe interest rates, pensions, Social Security, just don't exist anymore. Okay. And so because of that, where my grandparents' generation, they could save their way to wealth, right? If they saved and they just put it in safe assets, bonds, a savings account, things like that, they could count on that money to grow ahead, faster than inflation and be there, help them retain their purchasing power. Okay. Today, there have been structural changes in the economy that don't allow us to do those things. Okay. So there's 4 specific things that I've learned over time really have made saving our way to wealth impossible nowadays. Okay, and this is how we all got forced into being investors, right? In 401ks and IRAs, brokerage accounts, whatever. We have to do those things because we can't just plop our money in savings account or treasury bonds and count on it to be there, and to retain our purchasing power. So I'm going to use a 401k as an example because all 4 of these forces that erode our wealth, erode our purchasing power, play into the problem that I started with, right? Why so many retirees are working for 40 years, they're playing by the rules and still ending up with very, very little money. Okay. So the first one that I want to highlight is fees. Okay. When you put money in a 401k, you put it into an account. Fidelity, I mentioned, is one example, right? So let's say your company takes money out of your paycheck every 2 weeks and they hand Fidelity a chunk of money, right? Fidelity is going to take that money and allow you to pick between, say, a dozen mutual funds that your company has picked, right? Some of them are conservative, some of them are more aggressive, whatever. You get to pick the mix, right? And so you tell them to go put 50% in this and 25% in that fund and the other 25% in that fund. And every 2 weeks they do that, right? Money comes in from your paycheck, Fidelity distributes it, right? Well, each one of those funds is going to charge a management fee, right? Those funds exist. They're a conglomeration of different companies, and whether it's an index fund or an actively managed fund, whatever it is, there's some fee associated with it, right? Now, some of those fees are very, very small, but in general, the average fees are like 1% to 2% across the country. That's kind of the average 401k fees, right? Now, on top of that, on top of the fees charged by the individual funds, Fidelity, or whoever your administrator is going to charge funds as well, or fees as well, right? And up until a couple of years ago, those fees didn't have to be disclosed at all. Now, Congress has, since the Great Recession, has tried to make some efforts to make those fees more transparent, but there's still some very shady things that go on. My favorite one, or the one that ticks me off the most, is a 401k administrator is allowed to charge you fees to pay for their marketing expenses, right? That is not how I want my retirement dollars being spent. I don't want to pay Fidelity or whoever to market their stuff, right? I want those dollars working for me, generating a rate of return so that they're there for me when I retire, right? But a portion of those dollars every year are being eroded by fees, okay? Now you think about that, 1% to 2% doesn't sound like very much, right? And again, some of the index funds have very, very low fees, right? But years ago, I saw I can't remember what network did it, but somebody did a special on retirement funds. And one of the things that came out of that is that the effect of a 2% fee is that over the course of 30 to 40 years, 2/3 of the returns from your account would be lost to these fees, right? And I didn't believe it. That sounded like a lot. So like any good engineer did, I pulled up Excel and I modeled this out, right? And lo and behold, if you account for a 2% fee, so the way I did that is I said, okay, if I got a 6% return instead of an 8% return on average over 40 years, 2/3 of where my account would have been is lost to the fees. Okay. In other words, my account balance at 6% is 2/3 lower than it would have been with no fee. Okay. That's crazy. I had to look at it for a while. And if it's only 1% fee, again, it's about 1/3. Okay. So what's happening there is that over time, those lost returns from that 1% or 2% is still compounding, but now it's compounding in somebody else's account, right? Your fee man or your fund manager or your account administrator is now, those are now their dollars and they're getting the return that would have been generated by that. Okay. So that's one thing to understand, right? And as you progress in your career and your account balance grows, those fees get progressively larger every single year, right? Now the percentage may stay the same, but because your account balance is larger, those fees are larger, okay? And one of the other insidious things about this is, for example, in 2008, when your account lost 57% in your S&P 500 index fund, guess what? They still charge the fee. It doesn't matter what their performance is. You make money, you lose money, they don't care. You've got X dollars in your account and they get 1%, 2%, whatever the fee is. They get that every single year. So they have no incentive to make sure that you make money because they get their fee either way. Okay. So that's a huge one, right? And to me, that's one of the biggest reasons why the account balances are ending up so much smaller than you would expect, is because somebody else is milking your profits for 30 or 40 years. Okay. Now, second thing, again, is what I just mentioned, the market downturns. Okay. Now, when you go and you sit down with your financial advisor as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed 22-year-old straight out of college, they're going to tell you, look, here's a compound interest curve, and the market grows at an average of 8%. And if you just put X dollars in, compounded at 8%, you're going to be filthy rich when you retire, right? That's the pitch. That's how it goes. The reality is, compound interest gets interrupted when the balance drops. Okay. So think about this. When you put money in a savings account, right? Let's say your savings account gets 1%, which is fantasy land anymore. Savings accounts don't get anywhere near that. But let's say, okay. You can do the same thing, right? You can draw out a compound interest curve and say, if I put $100 in this account every month for 40 years, 1% interest, it'll be worth a bunch of money when I retire, right? But the reality is, life comes along and you save up, say, $5,000 in there, right? And now you need to go buy a car, okay? So you take out your $5,000, you go buy your car, and then you go and you start saving again, all right? Well, when you did that, when you took that money out, what happened to your compound interest curve? It went back to zero, right? And so you're starting over, okay? Now, if you've ever looked closely at a compound interest curve, it takes a while. It's pretty flat for a while before you get the knee in the curve, and all of a sudden the compounding effect, the exponential effect kicks in, right? And so anytime that compounding is interest, or that compounding curve is interrupted, it kind of resets the clock, right? Now, if in the example I use where I take it all the way back to zero, you're starting from square one, right? And if you do that and you have to buy a car every 5 years, say, you will never get that compounding effect. You'll never get that exponential effect, right? Okay, now take that example and think about what happens in your retirement account when maybe you are compounding 8% for a decade, right? But then what happens when you have a 57% loss like we did in 2008? Okay, what happens when you have a 30% loss like we did just a month and a half ago during this COVID-19 crisis? Okay, that has the same effect as taking the money out and buying a car did in your savings account. Okay, it interrupts the compounding curve. Okay, now it's not taking it all the way back down to zero, but it resets the basis from which you're compounding. And if you map that out, you never make up the difference, right? The growth will never get you back to where you were. The only way to get back to where you would have been is to dump a bunch more money in, right? But that's just you working harder. That's not compounding. Okay, so it will still compound over time, but the interruptions that you get from those market downturns has a massive effect over time on where your balance ends up. Okay, and the reality is that you don't get this nice clean curve that your financial advisor showed you. Okay, average returns are not realistic. Okay, that's not how the market really works. So that's the second thing, right? So we got fees that are eroding every year while we've got our money in our 401k. We've got market downturns that unexpectedly come up, but over the course of a 30 or 40 year career, they're going to happen, right? We're going to have these downturns. We're going to have our compounding interrupted. Okay. So those are the two things that kind of hit us while our money is invested, right? Now, the third thing is inflation. Okay. And basically, inflation means that the purchasing power of those dollars is being eroded over time, right? So the dollar that you saved when you were 22, that first dollar that went into your 401k, by the time you were 55 or 65 and retiring, that first dollar is going to buy much, much less than it did 30 or 40 years earlier, right? And so the result of that is you need more dollars 40 years from now than you did when you started in order to maintain the same level of purchasing power. Okay. And so inflation is just kind of this silent tax. Year in, year out, it's hitting you, right? On average over time, that's been about 3%, okay, that you lose in the purchasing power of your money. Now, again, 3% doesn't sound like very much, but if we go back to what we talked about a minute ago on fees, right? If a 1% fee costs you a third of your growth long term, think about what a 3% inflation rate is doing to your purchasing power over time. Okay, it's insidious. It has a massive effect over the long time period that we're talking about that you're working. Okay, so you get to the end, and the dollars that you have, that $195,500 average balance for someone in their 60s, that even today that sounds like a decent annual wage, but think about the impact of that. If you live another 20, 30, 40 years, even if you somehow maintain that principal in there and you still had $195,500, that's not going to buy you very much in 40 years when you're losing 3% a year to inflation. Okay. And you've got to account for that. Not only the fact that your dollars are losing value every year that they're sitting in your retirement account, but every year of your retirement, that purchasing power is going down, right? So if you start when you're 22, you work for 40 years, and then you retire and live another 40 years, you've got 80 years from when those first dollars went in and when you're gonna expire, right? And so over that period of time, the value of those dollars drops precipitously. Okay. Now the fourth thing is taxes. Okay. And this is one of those that I get a little bit passionate about because, again, you go and you sit down with your HR representative, you sit down with your financial advisor, and what are they going to tell you about taxes and retirement, right? Well, you don't really have to worry about it because you're going to be in a lower tax bracket, right? You're not going to be paying as much in taxes. And so it's okay that we're deferring the taxes now because you should be paying less someday, right? In 30 or 40 years when you retire, right? So here's why that bothers me. Okay. First off, being in a lower tax bracket, there's only two ways that you end up paying less in taxes, right? The first is you make less money. And the second is you change the way you make your money. Okay. So for example, an investor pays a lot less in taxes than someone who is earning money at a job. Okay. So you can lower your taxes by changing the way you make your money. Okay. But for most people, and what they mean when they tell you you're going to be in a lower tax bracket is you're going to have a smaller income in retirement than you do now. Okay. That doesn't sound like a good deal to me. Right. Now, you can argue, well, my house should be paid off and I'm not going to have kids at home and yada, yada, yada. Right. But if you're anything like me, you are doing okay on what you're making, but you are not by any means living high on the hog. Right. So to me, when I retire, when I'm financially free, I want to go do that. I want to go live high on the hog, right? I want to travel when I want. I don't care where my kids live. I want to be able to go visit them. I want to go do things with my wife. I want to be able to continue to contribute, to donate to causes that are important to me. I don't think living on less money sounds very cool. But that's what happens. If you are truly in a lower tax bracket, that's what it means. You're making less money and you have to make that work. Okay. So if that ends up being true, if you're in a lower tax bracket, that's what it means. You're making less money. Okay. Now, on the flip side, if you're not making less money, you're in the same tax bracket you are now, in theory. Okay. But I want you to think about a couple of things, right? Taxes, as high as they are today, are almost at historically low levels in the United States. Okay. Now, consider a couple of things. All right. The United States, right before the COVID-19 disaster, had almost $23 trillion in debt. Okay. In the last 2 months, Congress has spent or passed legislation to spend 2.6 plus trillion dollars. Okay. So they essentially just upped the national debt by 10% in 8 weeks. Okay. Now, where do you think that debt is going to be in 10, 20, 30 years? Okay. Consider this. When George W. Bush left office, the national debt was twice as big as when he came in. When Barack Obama left office, the national debt was twice as big as when he came in. Okay. Now, if Donald Trump survives another 4 years and follows that same pattern, the national debt will be hovering at about $40 trillion when he's done. Okay. And at the rate we're spending, if we're cranking out 10% in 8 weeks, we may surpass that. Okay. So that's one thing, is the government is spending like crazy. Okay. That money will never be repaid, but I don't know how you don't raise taxes when that happens. Okay. Consider this. Social Security, again, I mentioned this earlier, is insolvent. Okay. The taxes coming in will not pay for the expenses going out. Okay. If you look forward, the Social Security Administration every single year publishes a date that you can circle on your calendar when the trust fund will be depleted. Okay. Today, they're saying that's going to be 2035. Okay. That's long before I hit retirement age. Okay. So once that happens, the only thing they have to cover expenses is the money coming in, right? Well, that's not going to make a lot of people very happy because, one, they paid into the system all their lives and they were banking on this because they don't have enough money in their 401ks, right? So my guess is that to cover the tens of trillions of dollars in liabilities that Congress has created in the Social Security program and the Medicare program that's in the same boat, they're probably going to raise taxes so that they don't have to cut benefits. Okay. So to me, the taxes are just a math problem, right? The United States just has a math problem with their finances. I cannot envision any reasonable scenario where taxes aren't drastically higher 10, 20, 30 years from now than they are today. Okay. So you may be in a lower tax bracket, but chances are those tax rates are going to be much higher the low tax brackets are going to be much higher than they are today, right? So think about the fact that you are delaying your single biggest financial liability. Okay, taxes are everybody's biggest financial liability. Okay, think about the fact that by putting dollars in a 401k or an IRA or a 403b or wherever you're putting them, you are delaying your single biggest liability to the future, not having any clue what that rate will be. Okay, now I've taken money out of my 401k 3 times now. I finally broke the last few dollars out a couple of weeks ago. And I will tell you, the first time I did it, when I saw the tax hit, I was floored. Okay. Now I'm young, so there was a 10% penalty on top of it, but still, and I knew, rationally, I knew that not all of the dollars that I saw on my account statement were mine, right? I knew that a third of them belonged to the IRS, but still to see that much money come out of it made me look back at my account balance and realize it's kind of a lie, right? Because you see the number and in your head, you go, oh, I've got, however many hundreds of thousands of dollars you may have in there. That's a lie. 30 to 40% of that belongs to the IRS. And that's today. That's at today's tax rates, right? As rates go up, that percentage that you own just gets chipped away at. Okay. So those are the 4 things that are really making it impossible to save your way to wealth. Okay. The fees are eroding your wealth all year, every year. The market downturns that are going to happen periodically over the course of your career are going to interrupt your compounding. Inflation is going to slowly and silently eat away at the purchasing power of the dollars in your account. And then when you're done, before you ever get to touch the dollars coming out of your 401k, the IRS is going to take some unknown, undefined chunk of those dollars that you slaved over, you worked hard for, you scrimped and sacrificed and saved them, and they're just going to take whatever they want and let you have the rest, right? So those 4 things are very, very powerful forces that are eroding your wealth, okay? And they're not obvious, right? With the exception of market downturns, you don't really see the impact of the fees. You don't really see the inflation happening. The taxes are invisible because that's in the future, right? And so just day in, day out, year after year after year, the value of what you're putting into your 401k is being eroded, okay? And part of the problem with something like a 401k is the dollars go in and they just sit stagnant, okay? Money does not grow very well when it's stagnant. It doesn't like to sit. Money likes to move, okay? That's why, again, just like we talked about yesterday, right? The reason the economy slows down when people start saving is because the economy grows, money grows, money is happy when it's moving, right? It wants to move, it wants to be exchanged as often and as quickly as possible because that's how wealth is created, okay? But a 401k kind of is the exact opposite of that, right? The dollars go in and they just sit there stagnant for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And so they don't grow very fast, right? And that's just the principle that when they're not moving, they don't grow very fast. But when you add in these 4 things that are eroding the value of those dollars, it becomes very, very difficult to get to the end of that road and have enough money in there that you can reliably live 20, 30, 40 years, right? Now, some people do it, but I think Fidelity's numbers that I started with highlight the fact that it's very, very difficult to make that successful, okay? So is there an alternative? Yes, there is, right? We need to find a way where we can protect our dollars from these 4 forces, right? The world has changed. We need to change our tactics. We need to change the tools that we use. We need to change the strategies that we use so that we can acknowledge these 4 things out there, right? The fees, the downturns, the inflation, the taxes, and figure out how do we protect ourselves from those, right? And there are absolutely ways to do that. So that'll be a topic for tomorrow, but I want to talk about this concept that savers are losers, right? Now, again, saving is the fundamental habit to building any kind of wealth, right? You will never be financially free without saving. You have to do it. Minimum of 10% of your income is kind of the baseline, what you should be doing if you ever want to be financially free, okay? But what we have to recognize is after we've saved those dollars, once we've built that capital, we need to be very, very protective of them, right? And put them to work in a way where we're going to be protecting not only that capital, that basis, but also protecting the value of them over time. So that when we're ready to use those dollars, they're ready and waiting and just as useful to us when we're going to use them as they were when we save them, right? So that again, that'll be a topic for tomorrow, but hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully those are some things that you may not have seen or heard in that context, and may not have realized we're kind of chipping away at all the hard work you're doing to save for retirement. So that's what I got for you today. Everyone have a great day, and we will chat next time.